Go ahead, Zara. Ratification. Ratification, don't worry about that one. I will take that one off.
I have a question.
Yes.
What would be the initiative freedom? Do they come together or is it two separate?
Initiative. Well, let's stick in chapter 2 for now so we don't just keep jumping around. What else have you got in chapter 2? Go ahead.
1808.
What was 1808? The clause that banned slavery?
It stopped international slavery.
Go ahead, I'm waiting. You're ready to go somebody else.
It was like the clause that the people who did not accept slavery, that they made it to people like the law so they would stop slave trade. I think in 20 years.
Stop the slave trade. That's the thing. The 1808 clause was one of the pieces in the Constitution that dealt specifically with slavery. And the 1808 clause said that you would be able to trade in the international slave trade, just like you said, for 20 years, from 1789 to 1808. They couldn't just legalize, free the slaves. I guess they could have, but they just fought a war about property, and they would be taking away people's property. That would have probably led to another war. Why did they try and ban the slave trade? Go ahead, what was the logic? Okay, maybe not. What was the logic?
Okay, so I know that the northern had to do with taxes, like with the states started paying taxes, like the southern.
Okay, that's a different thing, and I'll come back to that, I promise. But why? Go ahead, what's the logic?
You think they were going to die out?
Yeah, the idea was that if you ended the international slave trade, then you wouldn't be continuing to bring slaves in, and then if you didn't continue to bring slaves in, ultimately they would die off, and the institution would go away. If you remember what I said, it only accelerated the importation of slaves, which actually made it worse. You, Leah, just started to get into the 3/5 compromise. Why was that 3/5 important again? Maureen said it was because of representation, and you're saying it's for something else.
Oh yeah. So the 3/5 was basically important because it dealt with taxes and how much tax each state would pay.
You paid taxes back in those days based on population. You gained representation based on population. The southern states wanted slaves to count as a person for representation. The northern states wanted them to count as a person for taxation. They counted as 3/5 of a person for both. So the southern states had to pay more taxes, but they did get more representation. Sorry, I think I had seen your hand before.
No.
I did not see your hand. Keon, go ahead.
What was that 1313 thing?
Oh, that's on the tape now. It's on the tape now. Yeah, anything new.
Yeah, it's the amendment article of
Okay, not everybody at once. Any other terms? Because I gotta go to class at 2, so we need to be moving. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Full faith and credit clause?
What was the full faith and credit clause? Because there were 3 or 4 parts to this. Go ahead.
That was the thing about the licenses that the states will recognize your document if you're in another state, right?
Article 4 of the Constitution is the full faith and credit clause. And there were 3 things, and one of them was the driver's license. If you have a valid state document, then in fact it will be recognized in a number of instances in other states. And I had mentioned to you the driver's license. Do you remember the other thing that I had mentioned? Marriage license, all the ladies yell out. And in fact, you remember what the third thing was?
present, like if you're a fugitive and you run.
Well, what's that called if you're a fugitive and you get caught in another state?
Extradition.
Extradition, the idea that they would extradite you back. And this tied into slavery because there were 3 pieces to slavery. Remember the 3/5 clause y'all gave me, 1808 y'all gave me. What was fugitive slave clause? Go ahead.
It's pretty much like if a slave ran away, then you would be required to, and like they were like a free place, like and you like saw that they probably weren't supposed to be there, you were like required to return it back to their owner.
Yeah, you were. Basically, and this is kind of tying in almost exactly with extradition. That's why it's kind of a big deal that this is in Article 4. But the Fugitive Slave Clause, if your slave ran away and was caught in a free state, or if a slave ran away and you found somebody up in a free state, they were obliged to be returned back to the owner in a slave state, even if they had gotten to a free state. Yeah, what other things have you got? And I'll go ahead and make sure that Fugitive Slave Clause is in there. Go ahead.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
So separation of power and checks and balance would go hand in hand, right?
Separation of powers and checks and balances go hand in hand. Does anybody want to talk about those?
No.
So separation of power would be the houses, right? The House of Representatives, the different branches of
Like what they
Oh,
can do,
I don't
what they
know
can
about,
do.
okay, the different branches, not the House and the Senate, but different
Yeah,
branches.
just the-
What are the three branches again?
Legislative.
Legislative, executive, judicial. Article 1, if you remember, was legislative. Article 2 is executive. Article 3 was judicial. How does separation of powers work?
They have each separate, like they have different powers, but what they can do, they all have branches.
Each one has different powers that only that one can use, absolutely. And if others tried to use it, then it's considered a violation of separation of powers. Can you give me an example of a power that each one has that in fact only that one can use?
The veto by the president.
The veto by the president is good. What's that word?
Making money is the only for the Congress.
Congress has the power to coin money. Yes, go ahead, Steph.
War, the president.
War in the, okay, well.
No, Congress.
Congress has the power to declare war. What power does the president have? Wage the war under what constitutional power?
Article 2.
It is Article 2, but what part of Article 2? I said it was a real general thing, and I was like, I don't know what this means, but we're going to come back to it, and we did come back to it.
Commander-in-chief.
Commander-in-chief, yeah. Any other powers that you can give me for separation? Go ahead.
The bill by the legislature.
Legislature passes the bill. Can you give me an example of a check and balance if the legislature passes a bill?
Judicial review.
Judicial review, the court could strike down a bill. Can you give me another one?
President's veto.
President veto is a pretty good example of this. Can you give me another one?
Congressional override.
Congressional override. Can you give me another one? Staffing?
Constitutional amendment.
Constitutional amendment? That could be possible. You might have to explain that a little bit more, but I'll take it. And the idea that the president nominates and the Senate confirms justices that go into the judiciary. Make sure that you're comfortable with examples. Remember, separation of powers says that each branch is going to have certain powers that only they can use. You could also make mention of a line item veto in there if you wanted to. The other thing that goes with this checks and balances, each branch has the ability to do things to stop the other branches from passing laws, like vetoes, like judicial review, like overrides we were just talking about. And ideally, what's the best way to be able to work separation of powers and checks and balances?
It's like two parties come together.
If you get two of the three branches to work together, because if it's just one, that's typically when it's most flawed. Any other terms that you see up here from chapter 2?
Article 6.
The amendment fractions are the 2/3 and the three things that we just talked about.
Yeah, it's still on the tape. It's still on the tape. You know what? Article 6 we didn't do. So I'm going to go ahead and take Article 6 off. But you know what I'll actually do is I'll just change it to Article 4 because that is what we did. And we've already talked about that. So I'll go ahead and do that. Any other questions that you've got in here? Talked about the articles. Told you not to worry about ratification. We dealt with the plans. Anything from chapter 1?
Initiative.
What was initiative? Because initiative, referendum, and recall basically run together. What was initiative? Go ahead.
It's like you want a law to be passed and then you get majority of people in your, to sign and then you vote.
Say that again?
You want something to be passed.
Yes.
So you get a majority of people, the vote from, like signatures from a majority of people in your whatever, and then you vote on it.
And then you vote on it. Yeah, that's the beginning of an answer. The initiative is, I had asked y'all when we were going over this where you went to get a law passed. And some of you would say a legislature or Congress or something along these lines. And I said, but what happens if the legislature isn't interested? This is where initiative comes in. You would draft a bill, and then after you draft this bill, you would take it around to collect signatures of registered voters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then who would verify that these were actually voters? The Board of Elections. Yes, Latifah, that's exactly. The Board of Elections would verify this. And when they got the right number, and it's usually, maybe 5 or 3% of registered eligible voters, then they would have this on the ballot as a yes or no question. In other words, if a majority would then vote yes, it becomes law, and Afwa, this would have been the law that you drafted. Do you remember what this was an example of? Direct democracy, the idea that you're basically doing things without people, or without the politicians, you're doing it just with people. And I'll go ahead and add direct democracy up here. Oh, it's already there, as a matter of fact. So you get the idea. Referendum and recall fell within this too. And let me stress to you, if the legislature didn't like the bill, they couldn't unpass it. The people passed it. The governor couldn't veto it. Courts could strike it down, but you'd have a ways to go to get there. Do you remember anything about referendum or recall? Go ahead.
Referendum was the legislature puts it on the ballot for the people to vote, so it's their idea.
Sometimes something is so hot you don't want to touch it, so you just vote it so that the people will decide. And if you remember what I had said on this was, if it passes, then the legislature looks good because they empowered you. If it doesn't pass, the legislature looks good because they empowered you. If it works, the legislature looks good because they empowered you. If it doesn't work, well, they empowered you, but you made the wrong call. I mean, they'll help you fix it. So they kind of wash their hands of controversy. Yes?
So for John Locke, you just want what he said? Or,
What did John Locke say?
Social
Give up
free-
certain freedoms for
pursuit
certain
of property, happiness.
Is it the social contract?
Social contract is where we start getting into this. It's the idea that if you remember, basically, you're going to give up certain freedoms in order to gain certain protections. And Keon, you're right. This is where you started getting into life and liberty and property kinds of pieces. So keep that thought in mind.
And then also the equality. Like, is that just the word equality, like people being equal? Or?
I believe I had asked y'all about freedom, order, and equality. And I think when we had talked about this, I had mentioned the idea of freedom. What was freedom exactly? The idea to do what you want to do. And you could put this in the context of getting married, as many of you already yelled out. You could put this in the context of education and pursuing a career, a number of things. Order. Do you remember what order was?
Yeah. Is it like law or?
Order was the idea that people wanted to be safe, they wanted to be protected kind of a thing. And then equality was the idea that people wanted to be treated equally regardless of who or what they were. This was a quick thing, but it was kind of an important thing. And I had mentioned to y'all that this was going to be a fight that we were going to have throughout the semester. Freedom and order and equality, because sometimes they are all on the same team, but then again, sometimes there's fights. Yes?
For politicians, you want to know, names of politicians, what they do.
What was the definition of politicians?
People that run for office.
Well, it could be people that run for office. I mean, and we talked a little bit about that. When I had introduced things, I had introduced, political science, politicians, politics, and government definitions. And politicians are basically the people that are in or around the government that are going to be kind of controlling things, running things. And I had mentioned to you that they could be elected like a governor or a representative. I mentioned to you that it could be a sheriff after a shooting. I mentioned to you it could be somebody that's on the news, the media, because all of these folks in their own way impact government, so they don't necessarily just have to have been elected. But we did talk about that.
The people who impact government.
That's the beginning, but again, it's on the tape, so we should have a pretty good stretch on this. Let's deal with some of these articles, because the articles are going to be a big deal. And let me just go into chapter 1. There's a video that deals with the Catholic school article, so I'm figuring that y'all should be fairly good as far as that's concerned. But make sure that you're comfortable with Michelle McCusker. Make sure you're comfortable with ultimately what happened. The argument of the Catholic Church. Her argument, did she win?
No.
She didn't win. Make sure that you can tell me why. What do you remember about the New Jersey drawing?
A boy 7 years
Suspended for 1 day.
Suspended for 1 day. What was that again, Kirsten? Kyle was suspended for a day. Why?
He drew a stick figure of himself with a gun. He did another stick figure that was his friend.
Yeah, he drew a stick figure gun picture, and I think he had even labeled it me
Yeah,
and the name of the friend. And did he just draw the picture?
No, he gave it
No,
to
he
him.
gave it to him.
And then it went home, and the parent took it as a threat. What was the policy that New Jersey schools had?
Zero
tolerance on guns.
Zero tolerance on guns. What does that mean?
No guns, no drawings of guns, no bringing guns, no toy guns, zero policy at all.
They basically said that if you bring a real gun, if you bring a fake gun, if you bring a rubber band gun, if you draw a picture of a gun, they're going to punish you. And what did they give him? And I believe a number of y'all wanted to give him counseling and all sorts of things. What was it ultimately that he said he drew?
A water gun.
Said he drew a water gun. Make sure that you can kind of tell me the story on this. What was the deal with Tubman?
Tubman
The
is the
$20
$20
bill.
bill.
And they were talking about like how other black people were on coins, but we didn't know.
Couldn't hear it, Tubman basically on the $20 bill, and Donald Trump said we shouldn't know, we should just put her on the $2
Should
bill.
put her on the $2 bill. And I had brought in some money, and we had talked about this within the context of who do you want on your money. And as I recall, the bulk of the classes seemed to say that as long as their money's spent, they did.